Welcome to Saltgrass, a show about how local communities can engage with the climate crisis at a grassroots level. My name is Ali Hanley. I was approached by two researchers from RMIT University last year to collaborate on a couple of episodes, which has now become 3 episodes, and this is the first one of the 3. The concept was to explore housing affordability in regional Victoria. That is, look at what the stresses are, what the local community is already doing about it, and also at some other innovative solutions that may be helpful. I don't know where you're listening from, but around here, everyone has been watching house prices and property prices go up for years, which, that's a good thing if you've got one, but it's not so great if you haven't. Then last year, we had multiple interest rate hikes, which put pressure on mortgage holders, which triggered rental prices to go up too. And as an aside, some people might argue that in some cases the rentals went up disproportionately, but that's a whole different conversation. We're not going to talk about that right now. But needless to say, lots of people I know have been struggling to find rentals that are affordable and suitable for their needs. And anything that is available is really hard to get. There's a lot of competition for it. And many who have wanted to buy a house or land have watched their dreams disappear as they are increasingly priced out of the market. I know several people who were saving for a deposit and they saved that deposit, and by the time they'd done that, the banks were saying it wasn't enough anymore. The two researchers from RMIT University who approached me to collaborate about the housing issue are Andrea Sharam, a senior lecturer in the School of Property Construction and Project Management, and Jen Lynch, a landscape architect and lecturer in the School of Architecture and Urban Design. They wanted to come out to Castlemaine and see what the housing landscape looked like in a regional small town and what interesting housing solutions were already happening here. But specifically, they wanted to have a conversation and share ideas about intentional or deliberative housing developments. And don't worry, I will explain what that means later. So in this episode, the first of the 3, we're going to hear about what the housing situation is like at the moment in this area. And then in the next 2 episodes, we're going to hear about, firstly, what deliberative development is and how co-housing and community building can be a part of the solution to the housing crisis. And in the 3rd episode, we will look at some of the other solutions that my community is coming up with around housing. And you might be wondering how all of this housing stuff fits in with saltgrass and sustainability and climate action. And I definitely considered that too before I agreed to collaborate. The obvious link between sustainability and housing is to talk about building methods and materials. So explore how houses are built, thermal efficiency, solar passive design, natural building materials, etc. As well as how older houses can be retrofitted to improve their insulation with things like double glazed windows, underfloor insulation, and filling gaps and cracks to stop drafts and breezes. And I would love to explore all of that and more in future episodes. And there are certainly several local groups and initiatives that are working on those things. We've touched on some housing-related topics so far in Saltgrass with the Salvage Yard episode at the start of this season. And in season 3, we looked at how household solar can play a big part in reducing emissions and helping people divest from fossil fuels in terms of their energy usage. But there is another layer of thinking here in terms of how housing and sustainability and the climate crisis all overlap. And as fortune would have it, Bill McGibbon published an article on his Substack that gave me the perfect quote to connect it all together. Bill McGibbon is from the US and he writes a newsletter on Substack called The Crucial Years. I highly recommend that you subscribe to it, and I'll put a link in the episode notes. He just unpacks climate stuff in a really thoughtful and careful way. When I'm looking for climate communicators, I'm always looking for people who don't make me feel racked with guilt or consumed by despair. And yet I also don't want people who gloss over the difficulties of what we're dealing with and the complexities of it. And Bill McGibbon walks that fine line really well, I think. He talks about the hard stuff, but he also leaves you feeling hopeful and like you're amongst many, many, many people who are working on this and you're not alone. He draws together stories of action being taken far and wide, and he is US-centric, but it's still good to hear what's happening from his point of view. And he looks at the systemic mechanisms at play. So the following quote about housing is from a piece titled "An Ever Smaller Board on Which to Play the Human Game." He's talking about climate refugees. Job one, of course, is to limit the rise in temperature so that fewer people have to flee. Remember, at this point, each extra tenth of a degree takes another 140 million humans out of what scientists call prime human habitat. By late this century, according to a study published last month in the journal Nature Sustainability, 3 to 6 billion people, or between a third and a half of humanity, could be trapped outside of that zone, facing extreme heat, food scarcity, and higher death rates, unless emissions are sharply curtailed or mass migration is accommodated. But even if we do everything right at this point, there's already extraordinary quantities of human tragedy inexorably in motion. So along with new solar panels and new batteries, we need new/old ethics of solidarity. We're going to have to settle the places that still work with creativity and grace. The idea that we can sprawl suburbs across our best remaining land is sillier all the time. Infill, densification, community. These are going to need to be our watchwords. Housing is, by this standard, a key environmental solution. Every man for himself politics will have to yield to we're all in this together. Otherwise, it's going to be far grimmer than it already is. So that's what these episodes are about. How do we rethink housing and build communities that minimise the impact of humanity on the natural world, and at the same time build solidarity, build communities that care for all of us, not just the most able-bodied, privileged and wealthy? As ever, I want to acknowledge that saltgrass is produced on Jara country, the home of the Dja Dja Wurrung. There have been zero-waste ecosystem guardians and custodians of this land for countless generations, and continue to lead the way and generously share their wisdom on how to live here better. I give thanks to them and honour elders past and present. Always was and always will be Aboriginal land.
Salt of the earth. Salt. Grassroots. Salt of the earth people. Grassroots change.
Saltgrass. Listen to all episodes of Saltgrass on your podcast app or at saltgrasspodcast.com. About 15 years ago, I bought a house in Castlemaine. I was able to scrape together a deposit for a run-down weatherboard house from the 1950s. It's still drafty and uninsulated. I'm still slowly fixing it up, and by many people's standards, it might seem kind of shabby, but to me it still feels a little bit like a miracle, because as a chronically underemployed artist who prioritised time in the studio over employment for the majority of my 20s, I never thought I'd be able to afford a home of my own until I did. The only other things in my state, in my price range at that time, were a dusty, run-down, depleted farm in the far north of the state, about 6 hours' drive from Melbourne, which is where I'd been living and where all my family and friends were. And the other option, aside from this house in Castlemaine, was a single car space in Melbourne CBD. Castlemaine was a town that I knew pretty much nothing about, but most of my friends said that they knew someone great out here, which was a big tick. And it was on the train line, which was another big tick. But honestly, I had spent 10 years share housing and renting, and I was just ready to take the leap. And I have never looked back. The idea of people moving out to the country when the city gets too expensive is certainly not new. And here in Castlemaine, I would just be one more person amidst waves of artists and creatives and tree changers who've moved out here seeking cheaper rents and more space over decades. As you'll hear, the topic of what affordable means to different people in our society comes up again and again in these episodes. But over the last year or two, with the Reserve Bank raising interest rates significantly for the first time in decades, and house prices going up dramatically, even couples with median incomes are struggling to afford houses these days, let alone those who are single, underemployed for whatever reason, or those who can't work at all. The rates of homelessness have noticeably increased, as well as the common refrain of people seeking local rentals and having to move away from their community just to have a roof over their heads. So let's unpack exactly what's going on in my regional community. I've spoken to quite a few people, and I'll introduce you to them one by one as we go along. This first episode will be an exploration of what the local housing situation looks like and who is more likely to struggle to find secure housing. In the next episode, we'll look at what deliberative development is, which is the model that Jen and Andrea from RMIT University are so interested in, as well as how co-housing can be a way to build community into your housing development. Then in the third episode, we're going to hear some other solutions people have come up with locally. Some are about multi-housing developments to meet the needs of the community, and others are creative solutions and ways to help people find the right housing result for them. All right, so let's dive in. I'm going to start off with Caroline Nielsen, or Kaz, who coordinates the My Home network. The network formed a couple of years ago and is a way to connect all of the various housing-related organisations, services and grassroots groups in the region. I asked her why the network started and how she got involved.
I was doing a little bit of work for the community house. It was a bit of piece of work around the local learning providers and why weren't women able to engage in wage work or be retained in wage work after they'd done certain learning training with the community house. And to cut a long story short, when we did interviews and focus groups, the main barriers, according to them, to enable them to get wage work and retain that wage work was affordable housing and family violence. They were the two main barriers. And seeing the intersection of family violence and housing crisis, obviously. So then we sort of did some work on family violence. We rolled out some training for various stakeholders and job-seeking organisations in the Shire. And then we decided to do maybe a forum on housing, because in my limited experience, it did seem once after talking to these women and then talking to various stakeholders, it was like there was this raising awareness and raising concerns amongst community and government and community organisations about the housing crisis. So we had a forum, and then the network came out of that forum. People decided to form a network of passionate community members. There was lived experience of homelessness and housing crisis there, community and government organisations, and community members with long decades of social housing sector experience and housing initiatives that were already trying to get off the ground. So that's how it formed.
Let's talk about some of the vulnerabilities or groups of people who might be most vulnerable to experiencing insecure housing.
We're focused on our shire because that's the data we get. You know, we're looking at our own shire's housing needs and dynamics. So a lot of our place-based or community-based responses is around that. But we're also seeing that a lot of these issues are common. So we're advocating for the nation and region and stuff. So certainly look, our priority groups, you know, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, LGBTQI+, and our local LGBTQI+ community, they've got great data on now the homelessness and housing needs, and a lot of that's been really invisible because ABS don't collate that data.
And is that because people in the alphabet soup, shall we say, sometimes rejected by their families of origin?
Absolutely. Their own family might reject their positioning or their status as they see it, so they become often homeless at a younger age because of that. The highest demographic of homelessness as it's increasing is women over the age of 50, refugee and migrant, and disability, of course. Those people who identify with an intellectual and physical disability.
And mental health
and mental health, yes. So and mental health across all of these, because that intersection of homelessness and mental health,
and
absolutely.
It's also a little bit chicken and egg, isn't it? Because experiencing housing instability leads to insecure mental health.
Well, there's various sort of streams of advocacy if you want, but one of the streams of advocacy is it's not just about housing, it's about having all the correct wraparound supports around. So it could be family violence supports ongoing as they transition into restoration, not just in crisis, but we're advocating for long-term adequate supports for that person and their children. So they can actually
find some stability.
So it's justice. It's not just a legal response. It's about justice as that woman and their children see it. So wraparound supports and adequate mental health supports. And look, Housing All Australians came up with a great report. And I don't always like arguing things in an economic framework, but they're basically saying, look, for every $1 you invest in adequate housing and wraparound supports, you get $2 back in terms of the social economic benefits and health and well-being of our community. So they are measuring over the long term, and governments don't necessarily do that. They look at the short term with bricks and mortar on the ground, tick. When we developed a 10-year strategy, the reason people wanted to go with a 10-year strategy was, one, because the state government was developing one and we'd put in a submission to it. And then it made us think, well, maybe we develop our own because we're about the long-term population impacts. around, getting housing for people and adequate, appropriate, sustainable, self-secure, affordable housing, but we're arguing it in terms of the long-term health and well-being benefits and community benefits, not just ticking off people who've got housing. So that's why we've got a 10-year strategy, and we've looked at short, medium and long-term outcomes. So the long-term outcomes are all around population health and social equality. That's how we're arguing it. We'll also talk to the climate change, because we see it as integrated. It's an integrated approach, so it's not just about housing, it's about First Nations self-determination, it's about climate change adaptation, it's about social inclusion, it's about really advancing things in gender equality and gender diversity. It's system change, trying to keep that conversation broad.
So tell me a bit more about the My Home Network. Who's involved?
Naldron Education Aboriginal Corporation, the Community House, MASARG, Mount Alexander Shire Accommodation Respite Group. They're really strong advocates around appropriate accommodation for the community members who identify with an intellectual disability. There's MASDAG there, Mount Alexander Shire Disability Advocacy Group. Then we've got Haven Home Safe, who are a regional housing provider.
And they focus on homelessness.
They sort of do outreach and then a whole range of, I suppose, interconnected services that are meant to help you transition on to. Mount Alexander Shire Sustainability Group are there because, that climate change adaptation piece is really important as cost of living and energy efficiency is really significant there. Delkaya Health is our local primary health, and also now what used to be known as CHIRP, the community health, so they've amalgamated. So I sit within the community health team, and they see that quality housing and access to affordable housing that's appropriate for their needs is directly linked to health and well-being.
So as you can hear from Kaz, there are a lot of reasons why people might find themselves in housing precarity. In Australia, we have certain amounts of social welfare, and some of that includes attempts to house those most at risk. It generally falls short, with quite a few people on very long waiting lists hoping to get homes. It used to be called commission housing, but it's now called social housing and is run by the state government. But that doesn't mean that our local Shire Council has no influence or ability to help people. I was surprised actually at how much our local council is actively working on the housing problem. I spoke with Rosie Anea, who was mayor at the time of recording. She is the youngest ever councillor and mayor of our shire and is a single mum to boot. She herself has experience with housing scarcity, and yet, as you'll hear, she is not alone on council when it comes to prioritising housing as a matter of importance. In fact, Mount Alexander Shire Council is one of the only councils to have a dedicated housing officer. Her official title is Housing Solutions Broker, and her name is Claire Richards. I had Claire and the mayor sitting on my couch with my dog Bobby blissfully wedged between them as we spoke, getting pats, as we talked about how council is approaching the housing crisis.
I'm really lucky to own my own house, but it was a challenge to get there, and there were many points in my life and in recent times where I was looking down the barrel of moving back into my parents' bungalow with my 2 kids, which would have been hard. And and this was when I was on council, so I think definitely there's still a bit of a stigma around who is experiencing housing instability as well. I think many people that I know are still renting. Some of them have had to leave the area because there's just nothing. And these are people who can afford to rent and who have references and who have kids in schools here, but just for whatever reason cannot get a rental. Or if they do get one, it's completely inappropriate and there's so much work to do on it. Yeah, I've got a lot of mates who are like that, and I think not all of them are young. Lots of them are not super young anymore. Lots of them are older. I think there's a lot of families breaking up, and of course when a family splits up, as many did over COVID, 2 parents needing 2 houses, it's just putting more and more stress on things. So yeah, I think we're really lucky that everyone on council has housing and affordable and social housing as a priority. And from our very first day that we all came in and met each other and went around the table kind of saying what our priorities were, all of us said affordable housing, which is pretty great, I think, because it was unexpected and it's something that we've all really stuck to our guns on. And while, we're really different people with lots of different experiences and different lives, the fact that we can always return to this and kind of go, this is where it's at, and then get that feedback from community that we're on the right track is so important.
As much as we know we live in a diverse community, I think working within council, you really get to see how diverse people's viewpoints are.
I think that what's really been encouraging for me is that so often we go out for community consultation on something and we get very widespread differences in what people think. Sometimes we can get almost 50-50 on what people want. And then you're kind of like, well, what do we do here? You know, this is not helpful, community. We know that there's a bit of conflict here. But on housing, pretty much across the board, the 2 times we've gone out for consultations so far on Templeton Street and on Tiny Homes on Wheels, it's just been hugely supportive.
Yeah, great.
So that kind of, and we'll talk about this more later, but that kind of alignment is one of the things that we think that's making what we're trying to do pretty special and giving it a lot more legs than it could have otherwise.
Yeah. Claire, we should introduce you.
My title is Housing Solutions Broker, and that's really aimed at reflecting the nature of what this work involves. That there are so many different moving parts to the whole system that part of the process of facilitating housing, and particularly facilitating affordable housing, is about connecting the parts of the system and connecting organisations and people and services to deliver housing, to get outcomes and to find a way forward. It involves advocacy, so working closely with the Mayor and with the CEO, developing our own internal policy processes, but also really contributing to the state and the federal level and to the broader environment, I guess, around affordable housing, because the system's broken. I've found over the last 2 years since this role commenced that I've just done an enormous amount of connecting and research and tapping into research and talking with a very wide range of the immensely experienced and skilled people out there. And it doesn't matter where you go and what you try and do, it's not working. Yeah? And in every corner and in every avenue there are challenges and complexities. So it's really hard for someone on the street to really comprehend that, how deeply our current system is not working.
We've seen this massive increase in prices of houses across the whole nation, and from what I hear, across the world. It's wild how much house prices have gone up, and it is pricing people out who've grown up here and their parents live here and their families here and all their friends are here and they can't afford to live in their hometown anymore. I feel like that's part of the broken system that you're talking about.
There are very clear and widespread conversations going on across the nation really about that we've got some very primary high-level drivers of the escalation of cost in housing that sit within government policy, particularly at the federal level. You can certainly address other factors to help try and bring down affordability, but the greatest impact and power comes with addressing primary drivers. Negative gearing and capital gains tax concessions are two.
There's also been a change of a lot of houses that would have once been rentals are now being used as short-term accommodation. And while it's not a huge problem here, there are a number of houses that were, for many, many, many years rentals and relatively affordable ones that are now used for short-term accommodation. And while obviously we need that here, it's about finding the balance of making sure there's enough accommodation that we can support tourism and people visiting, but also, all the rentals can't be gone. We need rentals. Not everyone's going to be able to afford to buy a house. Again, it's nuance. It's not as easy as just turn all your Airbnbs back into rentals, because lots of people don't want to have a rental. There is downsides to people having a rental as well, and tenant-landlord relationships and all of that stuff. It can be really tricky, but I think it has definitely compounded the problem a bit.
There are a range of things that can impact on dwellings being vacant, particularly around not so much vacant but not utilised for the long-term ongoing rental market. And we don't really have a data system in Australia that can clearly tell us what's what over time, give us clearer information about what we have and what we don't have. There are differences across Australia in the housing dynamics in different locations. I wouldn't say that ours is unique, but we have particular dynamics, and they're definitely shared by other locations which have some of the same characteristics as we do. So what we have here is we have an ageing population, and our overall population is very much focused on 1 to 2 person households. So we've got above 70% of households are 1 to 2 people, but at the same time, around the same amount of our housing stock is actually 3 to 4 plus bedrooms. So our household sizes are very small, and most of our housing stock is large.
We don't have a retirement village or anything. We don't have small units for our older population to move into when they need to downsize. So people are living as long as they can in these massive houses that maybe they can't even look after or appreciate fully, and they'd probably like a smaller place, but we just don't have any. So it's a real mismatch between the infrastructure that we have and the population we have. It's crazy. And we're just going to need more and more of these small, accessible, safe, easy to care for houses for our older population that we just don't have at the moment, which would hopefully free up those bigger houses for families and people who want to cohabit.
It's interesting. I mean, there's a lot of growth on the outskirts of Castlemaine and Campbell's Creek and everywhere with these new developments, but a lot of them seem to be quite big houses.
Contrary to what a lot of people probably believe, councils can't control what is built on a house. So we can set policy direction, and that's exactly what our strategic planning team does with their long-term strategic planning work. If you're coming from that voice of general community member, it's like, well, why can't we just put some houses on that block of land? It's like, that would be so good to do that. What's involved in getting those houses on that block of land? Firstly, who owns it? So that question of access to land. Unfortunately, in council, we own very little land, and out of that land, a lot of it is committed to existing uses. Having said that, council is very committed to finding which plots of our land we can use for affordable housing.
But there's a lot less than people think. I think that's been one of the things that has surprised a lot of people that I've talked to. Community members do seem to think that council has an amount of land somewhere that is just ready to build affordable and social housing on, and it's just not the case.
No, and in fact probably a lot of what might give people that perception would be state land.
Yes.
So part of what we do is we advocate to the state about utilising unused or underutilised state land in the Shire for affordable housing. So that question of who owns it, and then even if it's a piece of land that council owns and it doesn't have an existing use, you still then got to answer a whole range of other questions, like is the in-ground and the surrounding infrastructure sufficient? What overlays? How does that shape what you'd be able to deliver on that land?
What's the neighbourhood character like?
Yep.
Will people be okay with it? Such a big part of it, even if we identify a site that we think is okay, we then have to go and ask community what they think.
Yeah. Then you've also got to work out how do you fund this, and that really means getting either government concessional loans or outright government grants, or getting some sort of philanthropic partnership. Because an overarching principle of being able to deliver affordable housing is that you've got to reduce or remove costs from every single part of the whole process of delivering a home and then maintaining it and getting people into it as ongoing tenants. So you've got to be able to look at removing or reducing those costs at as many points as possible. The word affordable housing is certainly can be confusing because there's a spectrum of housing affordability, and at the most affordable end of that spectrum is housing that is provided either by the state or by community housing providers, and that housing can be provided to people on very low incomes, including benefits, because there are schemes to heavily subsidise the rental payments. So that's the sort of housing that enables people who might be, say, on an age pension or a disability pension to be able to get secure housing and to be paying usually no more than 25%, maximum of 30% of their income, but at that lower end of the spectrum, it's generally 25% of their income. And then community housing providers also have a degree of flexibility in who they take on as tenants, so they can house people who might have a little bit more capacity. They might be, say, working casually or part-time. They might be on a part pension and working a bit.
But we just know too that, for people who are homeless or sleeping rough, and for most people who end up in that situation, which is very scary and has been something that we've experienced here for the first time really since I can remember, that visible homelessness that has stressed a lot of people out, I think. One thing on that, the overwhelming message that I've gotten from people, I was really worried that I would get a bunch of emails going like, can you move the rough sleepers? Can you just move them along? We don't want to see them. Instead, I got a lot of messages saying, what are we doing? What can we do? Are we doing enough? Can I help? So that was really reassuring that people were more concerned about people being okay. What we know from, working with some people experiencing homelessness, there were so many other factors at play for them, and almost none of the services could be accessed without a fixed address. So the things that they needed in terms of medical or mental health or just general health care, they could not access properly without a fixed address. So I found that just so frustrating, and I think for so many people experiencing just housing insecurity even, the toll on your mental health of your entire family is so significant. And I just know people who've been living with it for years, signing 6-month leases, never knowing if it'll be renewed or the house will be sold. And it's just such an unpleasant way to live, I think, and not something that people should have to do.
I think too that unfortunately, because housing crisis has escalated, not got better, over the last 2 years, even since I've been in this role, that by and large the whole community is really understanding and seeing that housing affordability is a systemic issue and it affects everyone. It's not a niche issue. It's not something that just affects a very small number of people. It affects everyone.
And it's not someone's fault.
No.
It just, I think that stigma comes into it.
It's not an individual.
No.
It's not a household. It's not the fault of a householder. It's about our systems.
Yeah.
It's about our systems of economics and policy that create the environment that delivers housing. The other part of that is that the role of housing as a fundamental human need and as a fundamental human right, and also the role of housing as a crucial enabler of economic, not just growth, but actual sustainability, is so much more evident to the broader community now, because everyone knows it. Everyone knows people who've had to move or who are under enormous stress, or small business people particularly who are having to give up businesses, or just absolutely getting pounded because instead of being able to work on their business, they're constantly having to step into working in the business because they can't get staff because the staff can't live anywhere.
Yeah.
It's terrible that we're in this situation, and it also makes clear that issues around being able to access and afford housing are not individual, they're about the whole system.
There's so much need in the community and mismatches, and everyone should be doing what they can to try and make a difference. And there's been so much lovely stuff happening at a community level in terms of house sharing and house sitting, supporting people who are really in a crisis situation. And that's been really lovely to see as well, because that's the stuff that we would struggle with at council level because we don't have those services. And this is stuff that Delkaya manages, but they don't have the resources they need to do it to the extent that it needs to be done as well. So it's been really great to see community getting up and getting together and filling the gaps while we try and get better things in place to fill those gaps. And we're really lucky to have such a great working relationship with Delkaya so that we're able to approach these more homeless situations unified with them a bit, because they're the health provider obviously, and we're the council, and it often falls to one or both of us to do things in this space, but we can do a lot more if we work together.
In terms of what council might do, it really in the end depends on coming back to that question of how the delivery of the housing is funded. So typically when building affordable housing is funded by capital grants from government, there's a requirement that anything from all of that housing down to a certain percentage of it is for people who are most in need. So the sort of housing that might be delivered on any possible council land is really going to depend on how that build is funded.
So if council can get a grant and much of the cost is offset by funding that doesn't have to be repaid, effectively you can then offer that to people more cheaply, and you can offer it to people who may not be able to afford as much. But if council has to invest a lot of money into the land and the building of the houses, then you may be required to only offer it to people who can afford more rent.
It's that general principle, that the more it costs to deliver housing, the less room you have to offer deep discounts on rental. So that's why government grants around delivery of housing are so important and a really important part of delivering housing for people who are most in need.
Speaking of those most in need, I thought it might be good to hear from some people who have been working hard for over a decade to meet the housing needs of a particular group. MESARG is the Mount Alexander Shire Accommodation and Respite Group. Their sole focus has been to assist people with intellectual disability and their families. I'd like to acknowledge that our Shire has various services for people with disability, and there is another advocacy group that represents all people with disability called MASDAG, which is the Mount Alexander Shire Disability Advocacy Group. You'll notice that a lot of the acronyms around here start with MA because of the Shire name Mount Alexander. Finding housing for people with physical disability is, of course, also challenging, as not all houses available are set up to meet their physical requirements. And of course, disability is only one of the many, many reasons why people find it hard to get secure housing, as we've heard from Kaz at the My Home Network and Claire and Rosie from the council. MESARG is of particular interest to these episodes, however, because they have already successfully built a respite house so that families can have some time off from the demands of being full-time carers, and they have plans for future development of housing stock that would help people with intellectual disability move out of home, be a lot more independent, but still be safe and cared for. I spoke with 3 women who have all been involved with the running of the advocacy group. They are Jan Steen, Jan Jenkins and Heather Morrison. This is Jan Steen, President of the MESARG Committee.
MESARG started 15 to 20 years ago. I actually worked at Carer Support Services then, and we had a program called Ageing Carers Initiative. We got together with other service providers, hospital, carers, and from that we moved on to the big decision that there was no respite facilities in the Mount Alexander Shire. At that stage is what carers were calling out for. They needed that short break because people were looking after their loved ones 24/7, 7 days a week. Every other shire around had respite house. So we thought perhaps we had delusions of grandeur, but anyway, with lots of work and lots of public relations with service providers, service groups, government, we eventually got this wonderful house built. The house opened in 2016 in October, but to get there, raising that sort of money, as you can imagine, was an incredible feat. We were very kindly donated the land from the McDonald's family. So it's a big block, it's a substantial size, but there's only a small building envelope on it because of fire restrictions, so we've just got the one house.
And they donated it as a family because she had worked for the education department and had seen the terrible deal that was given to intellectually disabled people, and felt that if ever there was anything that she and her family could do for them, they would, and they heard of us and donated the land. But that's why
Amazing.
It was amazing. Yeah.
So we got the land, and then the Lions Club very generously come on board, and they gave us a huge amount of money. It was over $200,000 to go towards building the place. We begged, borrowed and stealed from fundraising, from shaking the tins to a car raffle. Both state and federal government gave money.
It was not easy.
It wasn't easy.
It wasn't just.
This is sounding very simplified, but it was a huge lot of negotiation and work, as you can imagine.
And how long did it take?
Years.
Yes, it did take years.
Yes. So we probably started about 2007.
Was our first meeting.
2007, and the house was completed in 2016. So
almost 10 years just to get the house
built. It's a long time, and it's a state-of-the-art house. It's a fabulous house with all the bells and whistles. Now, we don't actually facilitate the running of the house. We have an organisation who have got the capacity to staff it and to run it, because we don't. We're a group of carers and interested people from the community who want the best outcome for our loved ones. The respite house was actually part one of our strategy. Part two was trying to find permanent, safe, secure accommodation for our people.
We will hear more about part 2 of their plan in the 3rd episode, as we explore some of the ways our community is working to resolve the pressures of the housing crisis. I thought it would be worth spending some time chatting to 2 people who have been involved with Mazarg for years, as they are both carers and parents of adults with intellectual disability. This is Jan Jenkin, who is the treasurer of Mazarg, and Heather Morrison. I asked why finding appropriate housing for their children is so challenging.
They're vulnerable people, even some who are able to speak quite well and present reasonably well are still not intellectually the same as you and I. And they are quite vulnerable. Sometimes they have poor judgment in people in a fairly immature way, and yet occasionally will surprise you. There's something that they do know and understand, but it's very random.
So they may not be able to do basic daily functions for themselves very well?
A lot of them can't.
They can have a physical disability as well as, but we really are targeted towards people with an intellectual disability. However sad it is for people with a physical disability, they can advocate for themselves, whereas our people really need a voice. And it's usually the carer that is the voice for them.
The care that my son needs, he's not able to advocate for himself in any way at all. I'm very fortunate in that I've got a lovely son who has a very lovely nature. Now, that's just absolute good fortune that he was born with a very placid, nice nature. And so he's a very easy person to look after. But he is like looking after a child. I have to do all his washing, I have to cook for him, I have to handle his money, sort out what he needs for the day. He was damaged at birth and deprived of oxygen. So he's partially blind, which, does cause difficulty for him, and in the intellectual damage. He's 38 and, he couldn't live independently. I met him a few weeks and I'm fortunately very well. I don't even take a tablet. I'm totally well and I'm very fit, and so I'm fortunate in that.
Carers, as you can hear, they're doing a great job looking after their adult children, their loved ones, keeping them at home, but you do sort of sometimes think, it is a worry.
It is a worry. I wouldn't mind if there was somewhere suitable for him, and I knew that he'd be safe there. And
living with a friend and having service providers in that and respect that he would be safe for the rest of his life. Because none of us are going to live forever, Heather.
No.
Narelle is 46. She's the oldest of 3. No particular reason why she has an intellectual disability. If something doesn't go her way, she flies off the handle, and if things are changed, at the last minute. No comprehension of money, you just go to the bank and get some more, and they're the kind of things that worry me as far as her vulnerability. Buy anything, it wouldn't matter if it was $100 or $2, it's the same, she has no comprehension of that. I think the fact that housing has become so difficult anywhere, and the prices of things, Narelle would often look up places for sale, and then she prints them off and shows me we could buy this mum, and that could be $1 million, and I've got to explain to her that we don't have $1 million, Narelle. But that does worry me, what will happen.
So if there was housing stock in Castlemaine that allowed supported living, that was more independent, you'd feel more secure that they could live without you and still be safe.
Ageing parents, we're not going to be around forever.
No.
We want to see our kids in a safe house, secure housing with support, so that we can go to heaven or hell or wherever feeling that our kids are going to be safe. I think that's the crux of it.
Prior to Massag, I actually didn't really know anyone else who had a offspring with a disability. So from that point of view, Massag has been wonderful.
It's a bit of peer support.
Yes, and we are very close with each other and care for each other.
I think things are changing a bit too. This is coming from the outside and having worked in carer support, and people that I've met now with kids, and I am talking kids under 18.
Yes, they're quite different.
They're much more assertive and much more looking for the rights of their child and trying to have their child live as normal life as possible. And I think with the younger people, they want to know that their kids are going to be as independent as they possibly can and live the fullest life that they possibly can.
And they probably want a life for themselves.
And they want a life for themselves. It took us a long time to get the respite house, and we've had our ups and downs with this housing stuff. But we're not going to let go of that dream that we do eventually have a couple of house units, townhouses, whatever. We'd love some fund to give us a couple of blocks of land and a developer say, I'll build a couple of units for you. But in the real world, that's not going to happen.
And they can't get a loan, you see, that's another thing. Even though they've got that regular income,
they've got the pension,
they're not. They aren't eligible for any loans. No. So then it relies on families or parents if you've got
having
enough.
that spare million.
Yes, having that spare million. Which we don't have.
So I hope from this episode you've gotten a clearer picture of what the various stresses, dynamics and problems are around secure housing in this shire. One major factor, which was explained by Claire and Rosie from Council, is that there really are not a lot of smaller houses, units or apartments in the shire. This lack of housing stock means that a lot of single people or couples are living in 3 or 4 bedroom homes. If we could build more small homes and units, then people would be able to downsize, and that will free up the bigger houses for families and share housing. In the next 2 episodes, we're going to be exploring several ideas about how to achieve this. In the next episode, I'll introduce you to the 2 researchers from RMIT University who are interested in deliberative developments as a housing solution. We will hear from people who have been involved in deliberative development processes and how each one is able to be a unique answer to a group of people's housing needs. Then in the 3rd episode, we'll hear about what other solutions are being discussed in the community to help address the housing crisis. We'll hear from all the people you've heard in today's episode. So from Massag, we will have Jan and Heather, and they're going to talk about the 2nd stage of development that they're hoping to achieve for people with intellectual disability. Rosie and Claire from the Mount Alexander Shire will explain what solutions Council is looking at, and Kaz from the My Home Network will talk about some other creative community collaborations and solutions that people are looking at. So stay tuned as we unpack all sorts of housing possibilities. If any part of the conversation today caught your attention, there are links and notes about the show on the episode page, on the podcast and on the Saltgrass website. Don't forget to get your Saltgrass Ethical t-shirts from our merch shop. There are new designs all the time. For those of you listening on the radio, please note that you can listen to all episodes of Saltgrass on your preferred podcasting app or at saltgrasspodcast.com. You can follow us on all the socials, and you can subscribe to our email list to get reminders and updates about the show. This program was made possible with support from Main FM and the Community Broadcasting Foundation. Find out more at cbf.org.au. And these 3 episodes and the research of Jen and Andrea were also supported by RMIT University's Strategic Impact Fund, which supports interdisciplinary research translation through projects that bring together RMIT researchers, industry and community. My name is Ali Hanley. Thanks for listening.
Salt of the earth. Salt. Grassroots. Salt of the earth people. Grassroots change. Saltgrass.
Listen to all episodes of Saltgrass on your podcast app or at saltgrasspodcast.com.